Thanks a lot for coming to the Regulatory Challenge panel discussion. So since we have a very concise group of people, we would like everyone to come up front, if possible, and we want the session to be more interactive today. So if you have any questions in the middle, or you want to have some commentary to the speaker, please feel free to do so. So it's my honor today to introduce you to the great panels, Carrie Osman, CEO of Cruxy&Co, and Janos, CEO, founder of SuperCharger. And he has a lot of amazing projects, including a PhD degree coming, and also director at PayPal for government relations, Noriko Annen. So we will start with a very quick overview and the regulatory landscape of UK, followed by what's happening in Hong Kong, and to have a discussion on the Japan regulatory system. So I will turn the mic to Carrie to start with UK.
Good morning, everyone. I'm not normally very good at staying sitting down. So if I get a bit excited and start walking around, then I'll just try to be very loud, which I don't seem to have much of. Thank you so much for the invitation to FinSum and obviously to the team at PayPal for helping us set up the panel. It's been really enjoyable and lots of fun. I'm going to cover off some top-line facts about the UK fintech ecosystem, because mainly Janos, who sits to my right, is very much the expert in regulation. So I've always been taught you shouldn't try to outdo someone who knows a lot more about the subject than you do. So he is going to go into a lot more detail about regulation and the global kind of standards. He's also going to cover a lot more on the UK regulation and how the regulator is fueling the UK, but I'll try to touch on that as well. So, why am I here? I was invited by the team at FinSum, so Una and Nick, and the role that my company plays is very much to advise and help investors, so venture capital investors through to private equity firms. In the VC landscape, a lot of very complex fintech investments are done out of the UK. We have a relationship with some banks where we try to kind of help them understand what's going on in the fintech space, and some of them seem to get their heads around that very much easier than others, as I'm sure is true here as well as in the UK. Fintech companies, so we work with a lot of CEOs and founders to work out how they should grow and what they should focus on. We're involved in the Open Banking API Challenge, which is a UK open banking challenge that they've set to a number of companies. And we do quite a lot in the reg tech space. So that's kind of why I get to have an amazing trip to Tokyo and enjoy your company. But what is going on in the UK at the highest level? The fintech ecosystem. So the first half of the year, 564 million was invested in fintech companies in the UK. That's a 37% increase on 2016 for the first half of the year, and it really does continue to grow and develop and kind of become a true industry in its own right. 60,000 people in the UK are employed in fintech, and it contributes £7 billion in pounds, but so $8.6 billion to the UK economy. So it's very important for us to stay at the forefront of fintech and to do whatever it takes. And you see that coming through in the way that the regulator is behaving and trying to stay at the forefront. I'm going to touch on that, and then Janos will come on to a bit more detail. So what have been the drivers? What have enabled us to get to that kind of position? Well, there's fintech hubs. I don't know if I can move. Thank you. Oh, that's better. I just feel like I need to kind of come and say hello down here. So you've got fintech hubs. I know that you guys haven't heard a lot about these, but things like Level 39, which is based in Canary Wharf, if any of you ever come and visit, I'm sure Ben Brabin would love to host you. Great guy, very open about being a centre for international fintech when it comes to the UK ecosystem. And then you've got other things like Innovate Finance, which is government-backed. They're all really set up to try and help UK fintech companies to succeed. Innovate Finance this week has had a big conference on how to scale. There's lots of scale-up initiatives that are going on. I think the UK sees that we've achieved good traction in terms of the earlier stage, but how do we take companies from here to here? We have 4 unicorns in fintech, but what is it going to take to get that to 16? What is it going to take to get that to 50? They're the questions that we need to ask ourselves. Oh, I've got two things there. The banks themselves, they are really fueling the ecosystem. So you've got the likes of Barclays. They have Accelerator called Rise, which they've recently relaunched. A lot of the banks like Santander, they're trying to set up almost accelerators but that sit within the bank. Commerzbank and ING, for example, they have a whole floor just for innovation, and they're trying very hard to bring in these companies and say to them, look, come and be part of us, let's work together to really drive change from within. You've got investors who are specifically kind of bridging the gap. So there are investors that, you've got the standard players like your Balderton, Index Ventures, etc. But you've also got some very specific investors who are bridging this gap between the financial industry and the startup ecosystem. One is called Seismic Foundry. They are a group of people, Catherine Lyle, who was on the board of Deutsche Bank, and one of the guys who was on the board of Deutsche Börse. And they have set up to specifically help early stage capital markets fintech companies. So the investment landscape is starting to really pivot towards where the challenges lie. There's another investor called Illuminate Financial Management, funded from a number of the banks, including IHS Markit and Deutsche Börse as well. And they specifically look to scale companies that are targeting the problems capital markets face. A lot of reg tech firms that are being backed by them at the moment, including Reg Tech Solutions, Chart IQ, those kind of guys. So the investors you're seeing gravitate around the problems that the market has and is trying to solve. Then the government have developed some different roles. So you've got a new role called Chief Digital Officer for London, not just tweeting, but actually having quite a big role in terms of driving the ecosystem. And that's Theo Blackwell who's gone into that role. And you've also got people like Eileen at Passion Capital, who is a partner who is now also an envoy when it comes to fintech for the Treasury. So the government is trying to really back fintech in quite a big way, and they have some bodies, so London and Partners, which takes companies from the UK to Silicon Valley, British Business Bank, which supports match funding for fintechs, which I know you guys have a lot here as well. So that's just a very broad stroke on how the UK has fueled that ecosystem. And there is also something which has sprung off the back of that, which is that regulation in itself has become an amazing opportunity for fintechs. I don't know if you know, but in the UK, 0.76% of our GDP is spent per year just on solving regulation. So, you know, if you're trying to sell to a bank, just make it about regulation. That's all they're looking at for the next 3 years. That is a quote from a partner at Goldman. Regulation is becoming almost their new hot topic. So how has the regulator in the UK kind of helped with the ecosystem? The sandbox was obviously created a while ago now. The second wave of the sandbox had 71 applicants. So 71 companies applied, which is obviously pretty vast. and the Bank of England Accelerator. The whole idea is basically to completely fast track and support these companies to try different things, to be playful, to experiment, to fail, and we'll talk about failure later. But the concept is that if they're going to fail, they should fail quickly in that sandbox environment. Lots of nods, so I guess you all know that. That's a ridiculous, obvious point. And the FCA is trying to theme their support around big drivers of the market as well. And what they're really trying to do, I mean, there's a quote here, but the Bank of England stress tests have identified 40 billion of additional conduct costs when they looked at just 7 banks. And I think the FCA is trying to enable fintechs to help solve the problems of the banks, but at the same time, they're just constantly trying to walk that line of giving the right level of competition, but at the same time not really decimating the banks themselves and not giving them the opportunity to respond. So they talk about themselves not only stopping the bad, but enabling the good. And I think this is the mindset of the regulator. So when we talk about how they should think, in the UK, they're trying to really fuel competition. They see their role as fueling competition and fueling innovation. How do we stay at the forefront, and what is that going to take? So no mean feat. And I guess linked into that is around co-creation. So they talk a lot about how do you co-create? How do you kind of enable, the quote is, the people needing to be regulated are also the people developing this technology to enable it to happen. So you've got the regulated spawning off ideas to fuel and solve that problem of regulation, which is in itself, I'll let Janos cover lots more on that, but it's an interesting dynamic. So what is the future, and what does the UK need to do, I guess? What are the challenges that face? Well, Christopher Woolard, who is heading up the FCA when it comes to fintech and the fintech kind of regulations, what we're trying to do to stay at the forefront, talks a lot about the globalization. We can't have regulation which applies in one country or on one exchange, which doesn't apply to other countries. So how do we create global frameworks? How do the UK drive that and work with other countries? So hopefully, you guys would be at the forefront of that. But also, we don't want to end up with this kind of Wild West, as he calls it, the Wild West that could emerge, where different companies go and spawn off in different domiciles, and they're all regulated in different ways. We need a framework, and I think that's what you'll see the UK trying to drive globally over the next couple of years. So what are the areas that we need to watch out for? Data is going to be, obviously, it's ridiculous to stand up and say data, it's crazy. But things we have like GDPR, so the European General Data Regulation, Protection Regulation for consumers, but that directly opposes MiFID II, which is a regulation on asset managers and investment banks. So you're seeing these clashes of regulation where one doesn't actually help the other, they've been done in isolation. So I think how people will respond to data is going to be key. RegTech is obviously spawning out as its own industry. People in the UK would talk about RegTech as very different to FinTech, so they know they're part of FinTech, but RegTech is really getting its own, getting a lot of energy and a lot of focus. A lot of investors only want to look at RegTech. I think it's very interesting. So you've just seen Cybernetics, which has been bought, and they track traders' behavior. So seeing, obviously, that team, exit shows that I think RegTechs might be nearer to the exit that some VCs would like than maybe some of the more consumer-centric fintech solutions. And then how do companies balance their regulation and data when they sit across different jurisdictions? If you look at the global ecosystem, we don't think of ourselves as only operating in the UK. I'm here talking to you. You don't really think, oh, I'm not actually operating solely in the UK. So how will that drive regulation, and how will we see Christopher Woolard and the regulator at the FCA actually be very forward-looking when it comes to globalization? So that's it. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Janos.
thanks Carrie for the pressure on me for doing a great presentation about regulation. I know it's early in the morning as well, so it doubles the pressure, but that should be okay. So thanks a lot, Una, thanks a lot, Vincent, for the invitation. What I will be doing for the next 20 minutes, I'll be talking to you about fintech in Hong Kong very shortly. The reason why fintech in Hong Kong is short is there's only 150 startups, no investment, and the government is good but it's not great. So that's sort of the very bleak picture of fintech in Hong Kong, especially compared to something that's happening in the UK. The UK has, over 900 fintech companies. There's hundreds of millions of pounds of investment every single year. It's growing. But just to give you a sense, in Hong Kong has around 180 million pounds of investment in fintech last year, but a single company took 170 million away. The rest of the 20 million which is left is shared across 140 companies, which really means every company is sharing about 50,000 pounds of investment, which is nothing. And this year is going to happen again. So keep watch for the next numbers about investment about fintech in Hong Kong. Most likely the number is going to be around 150, 170 million. But again, a single company two weeks ago raised 115 million US, just that one company. So you have massive outliers in Hong Kong, which is good, but it's essentially unhealthy for a well-diversified system. Now, Hong Kong being a small market, regulation has always been very, very important. If you think about Hong Kong is 8 million people, and therefore regulators literally can see any fintech company pretty much from their office. I often joke that when you go to the HKMA, it's at the top of the building, and literally you have the regulators sitting over all the other banks. And that's pretty much the same attitude that they have towards fintech companies, is they have the impression that because the market is so small, it's pretty straightforward for them to regulate. Now contrast that with what you have in China. In China you have this expression which is the emperor is far and the mountains are high. And this is this idea that China innovation can happen because the regulators cannot see at any given time all the startup and all the innovation that's currently happening. So that's pretty much kind of the summary that you would have in Hong Kong. So what I'm going to do now is, if there's one slide you need to remember, that's this slide. And this slide essentially is a list of questions for any country to build a regulatory framework on fintech. The short answer is every country is going to be unique. Japan, for example, as a regulatory system, is a product-based regulator. So you're going to have a regulator for securities, you're going to have a regulator for banking products, etc., etc. The UK changed. The UK is a twin peak regulator. So one regulator does consumer protection and one regulator does prudential regulation. But it doesn't really matter if you do securities, insurance, or banking. As long as you touch consumer or that you're a firm, this is how the UK regulatory system is done. Now in the context of Japan, that's different. It's a product-based regulator, just like Hong Kong and just like the US. And the reason why that matters is you cannot actually do fintech regulation without taking into account the specificities of a country. Let me give you an example. At the end of this presentation, I will talk about regulatory sandboxes. Now, what you will notice is that typically, around the world, securities regulators cannot do regulatory sandboxes. Typically, central bank issue regulatory sandboxes. And the reason for that is because securities regulators don't have the same mandate and power to allow for innovation to happen. Okay? So the localization of regulation, especially in the context of finance and fintech, is critical, and this is just a framework that allows you to scope how your framework in your country should apply. So why does fintech regulation matter, and what does financial regulation matter? So we're pretty much marking the 10-year anniversary of the financial crisis and the iPhone. But on the financial crisis side, essentially, what we've been taught for the last 10 years is that banks are actually pretty bad at regulation and they're pretty bad at compliance. There is any 1 or 2 years, one of the big scandals coming through. And to give you an order of ideas, for every $1 US spent on regulation, 3 is spent on regulatory fines. So even though banks spend a lot of money, and Carrie talked about it's slightly less than 1% of the GDP, even though they spend so much money, they still don't fully get it right, and they still get fined more than they actually spend on compliance. And the problem with that is, well, actually it matters to people. It impacts society. I came out of university in 2010 during the financial crisis, and the direct consequences of the financial crisis on me was I couldn't get a job. But if you look at other people, for example, in the UK, the NHS, which is the healthcare system in the UK, had reduced funding, and therefore mortality for cancer increased by 500,000 people. That's 500,000 more people dying of cancer in the UK because of the budget cut that the financial crisis has created. And what I'm just trying to do here is I'm just trying to bring home the importance of fintech regulation, because what we don't want is an industry that grows and then generates the same level of risk and instability that you had in other markets. So about SuperCharger, that's John F. Kennedy, and I'm not John F. Kennedy, but what we want to do is accelerate the pace of change, and that's what we've achieved in the last 3 years. So to give you a sense, we train about 20,000 people through a book. We're going to aim to hit 250,000 people in the next 3 years. We're going to try to work with 500 startups. So we as a company want to be exponentially growing as well. And Japan is one of the countries where we're looking at it coming. Now, if I look for you about fintech, so in this room, just as a quick sign, how old do you think fintech is? Do you think it's something recent? Do you think it's something that has been established 50 years ago, 100 years ago? So shows of hands, who think that fintech is over 100 years old? Okay. Shows of hands, who thinks that fintech is 50 years old? Less than 10 years old. Who needs a coffee? We'll get you a coffee then. So fintech is, you can trace back fintech for about 150 years. And the reason why that is important is that when you build regulation, now regulators know that they can look in the past and see at models of regulation previously, and then bring it back forward. And I'm going to walk you through that. So we define fintech into 3 separate eras. You have fintech 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Fintech 1.0 was the era of the infrastructure, 1860s, 1960s. And this was about the telephone and the telegraph. Now, think when you were in the UK before and you wanted to purchase stock in New York. And you would be in 1890s or 1900s. Well, literally, you would have to take the boat, go to New York, buy the stock, come back, it would take you 6 weeks. And then what happens? The telephone and the telegraph happens. And now you could purchase stocks within minutes. So that's, for example, one way of how technology has been used in the context of purchasing stock. And this was very much government-led infrastructure project that allowed technology to happen in finance. Fintech 2.0 was about the era of banks. Think about ATM, think about e-banking. And again, a lot of the regulatory issue that you had on e-banking is something that we're asking today about fintech companies, which is, what does it mean what does cross-border marketing mean in the context of e-banking? We go from signature to pin and chip. We go now from pin and chip to fingerprint. This is a question around authentication for payment. Regulators have struggled with these issues as we went from banking to e-banking. Now regulators are struggling as we go from e-banking to fintech. And regulators simply look back in history and say, this is how we approach the change of innovation. Now, one of the important notions is we shouldn't say that fintech regulation is about regulating innovation. I think that is totally wrong. Fintech regulation is about regulating competition and actually enabling competition to happen. This allows 2 things. The first thing is we always tend to corner regulator and say, well, it's kind of contradictory of regulating innovation. Innovation cannot and should not be regulated, which I fully agree. However, competition can be regulated and promoted through regulation, right? You can create laws that support competition, etc., etc. And so the regulation of competition, in my view, is the main driver of fintech innovation. And the point about this is, if I take 3 countries in the world, the UK, India, and China, the UK, open banking, Carrie is talking about open banking. Open banking API, it's all about increasing competition in the financial services industry. If you look about India, India is about proportionate banking. So now instead of having a full banking license, you can have a banking license tailored to your product. You can have a saving banking license, you can have a lending banking license, you can have a deposit banking license. This is proportionate to your size, allowing new entrant to enter the market. And finally about China, China's about invisible banking. So it's about Alibaba, it's about Tencent, creating financial services through their core offering. Essentially, it's new players coming into the market versus the state-owned banks that used to be in China for the last 70 years. So, and financial being essentially one of those examples. Now, balance and proportionality. So the good thing is, whenever you talk to a regulator, and whenever a regulator doesn't know an answer, we'll say, well, it's all about balance and proportionality, which means I don't have the full answer, but really it's going to be sort of neither or type situation. But let me explain you what that actually means. This is a single sentence that has been added into the mandate of the FSA, which is now FCA in the UK. So the FCA is the consumer regulator in the UK, and they've added a single sentence to their mandate, which is promoting the effective competition in the interest of consumer in the market for regulated dialogue. Now, what you know about regulators is that regulators are very good at following the rules that they set for themselves. What that single line does is now if you're a fintech company that actually creates competition in the market, the regulators have an obligation of looking at you and talking to you. So that single line has created one of the very big changes that the FCA is now currently going under, and this is why preschool learning, etc., are now driving fintech innovation. It's about essentially that single line on competition. We talked about data, and I think it's important because the future of regulation is going to be at the intersection of financial regulation, which regulators know how it works, data management, and digital identity. Think about the new business model that fintech companies are currently operating under, whether it's in China, whether it's in the UK, a lot of them are monetizing data. Data monetization is not something that falls under financial regulation. And therefore, you start to have a framework that's not fit for purpose anymore, because you have typically regulators for financial regulation, you typically have regulators for data privacy, data management, and you clearly don't have regulators for digital identity. And so the future of regulation is going to be either a joint regulator or a coordinated regulatory body that will create this. So that's kind of like sort of the evolution of fintech. So like I said, 1.0 was about infrastructure, 2.0 was about the banks, 3.0 was about the startups, right? So very much when we talk about fintech companies, very much yesterday when you had pitch competition, it's all about startups. And the future is very much going to be about study of banking as a service, open banking, etc. So I have about 5 minutes left. I think I'm going to be on time. Who here is aware of what a regulatory sandbox is? I have 5 minutes. Okay, so great. I'll get you guys coffee for the next 5 minutes then. So who here knows what a regulatory sandbox is? 1, 2, 3. It's like an auction. 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so about 20% of the room. So a regulatory sandbox, it's an interesting notion. It actually didn't start in finance. So regulatory sandbox is a principle that comes from the tech world where it's a testing environment for you to double check if a software is okay. And so the financial regulators have said, well, I actually want to see if I can create a testing environment to see whether or not a startup is okay. And the reason why you need a regulatory sandbox essentially explains that graph. So companies there's 3 stages of companies. Too small to care, too large to ignore, too big to fail. Now, financial institutions have grown organically. So typically, banks have grown over the course of 20, 30, 70, 100, 150 years, but they have a pretty much linear growth because they either grow organically or they grow through acquisition. But you really know when they're going to be essentially too large to ignore. So for the regulators, it's always a question of resources. Regulators typically are understaffed and under-resourced. So they're not going to start regulating every single person in the market. They're only going to start regulating you once you're being too large to ignore. So here is your threshold point where regulators will look at you and say, hey, now you should get a license, okay? For example, one of the definitions of a bank in Japan, but also internationally, is a bank is a deposit-taking activity. If I would go around this room and you would all give me money, and I would keep for you and give you interest, I would essentially be performing a deposit-taking activity. But yet I'm not a bank. Now, I shouldn't say that. The good thing is the Bank of Japan is not here, but if Bank of Japan was here, what they could say is, are they going to sue me and attack me? No, they won't, because it's not worth their time to attack one person that took deposit from 20 people. So I'm too small to care, essentially, for the regulators. Once I'm going to start getting 10,000 people in Tokyo and get the deposit, now the regulator is going to say, you're pretty much acting like a bank, you need to get a license, right? So this is this idea of, there's really a threshold point when regulation matters. Now, startups are slightly different, because startups don't grow linearly, startups grow exponentially. And the example here is, think about, so who here is aware of a company in China called Yuebao from Alibaba? It's a money market fund. Okay, so Yuebao in China is a money market fund that went from 0 to 900 million, from 0 to 90 billion of assets under management in 9 months. They became the third largest money market fund in 9 months. 9 months later, they have $170 billion of assets under management, and they're the largest money market fund in the world. I can give you another example. Who knows here the messaging app Kakao? Kakao Talk? Korea? Yeah? So Kakao Talk is like Line, right? So it's similarly like WhatsApp. So Kakao now is a bank in Korea. In 4 weeks, they had 1 million customers. So if you bring back that chart here, essentially, whether it's Yuebao, whether it's Kakao Talk, whether it's all those fintech companies, they go from too small to care to too big to fail overnight. They skip the too large to ignore, and as soon as the regulators say, I'm going to start regulating you, it's a bit too late. And therefore, a regulatory sandbox allows regulators to identify the growth of a company, but also, most importantly, allow to identify who are the main stakeholders in a company when it fails. Think about this. Most people here must know the CEO of, Mitsubishi Bank or, HSBC, Barclays, it doesn't really matter. Does anyone know here the CEO of Yuebao? No, and the same thing for the regulators. So if you think about this, a sandbox allows you to understand the business model, but also the decision-making in the company, if that company was to fail. The reason why regulators have to essentially perform their mandate, we often talk about the complexity of financial regulation, but really regulators only care about 4 things. And that's the only thing that they care about. Now the question is sometimes one is more important than the other. So the 4 key mandates that any regulator in the world have is financial stability, prudential regulation, which is regulating firms, conduct and fairness, and competition and development. Now depending on the country and depending on the market, one mandate is going to be more important than the other. So competition and development in the UK at the moment is incredibly important. However, in Hong Kong, it's all about financial stability. So remember how at the beginning I said Hong Kong is very unexciting for fintech? So that's the reason, because essentially the regulators goes, well, the market is going okay, I don't really want to disrupt HSBC, so let's create more stability, it's okay, right? We don't need to change anything. So the Hong Kong regulators really care about financial stability. And so depending on which market you are, whether it's more conservative, whether it's more aggressive, whether it's more consumer friendly, those methods are going to be changing, and that's going to be impacting the way fintech regulation is done. That's the last slide, and I will have about 5 minutes. Okay, so last slide. Carrie said something which is very interesting. So when we look at regulation, how it's currently done, the current regulation is all about consumer protection, prudential regulation. So prudential regulation, by the way, means the regulation of a firm, right? So that's what it stands for. Financial stability, preventing bad behavior. It's about reactive reporting and licensing. Now, the future of regulation, it's kind of funny because why in the financial market we only try to prevent bad behavior? Why can we only fix fines by putting fines into people as opposed to, essentially self-select the good performing actors? And Carrie had a slide about this, which was we shouldn't just be blaming financial institutions, we also should be rewarding financial institutions that are doing a good job. Essentially, we should have a positive network effect when it comes to self-selecting participating markets. The other one is, I think, consumer protection is outdated. Now what we need to look more is about data, essentially data protection. Recently, Equifax, which is one of the largest credit scoring company in the US, to give you a sense, Equifax has data on one out of 2 person in the US. Their data got leaked. And me as a consumer now, if I was a US citizen, it may impact my capacity of borrowing, it may impact my mortgage rate, it may impact quite a lot of different aspects of my financial life. Now, because the data was not protected, now me as a consumer am harmed. And therefore, data protection, data privacy becomes as important as consumer protection. I think that financial stability should not anymore be understood in the context of one firm. It should be about financial networks. What we have seen about the financial crisis is firms tend to fail in a network, right? There's sort of a domino effect, and I think regulators need to better appreciate that. And finally, what I will leave you with is the new barriers to entries are not anymore regulatory licenses. The new barriers to entries are about algorithm, essentially deep learning. If I wanted to be Google tomorrow, it doesn't matter if I have exactly the same data as Google, the same amount of servers. Why? Because Google has trained their algorithm for the last 10 years the value of Google is in the algorithm. No one can copy Google because Google has their own algorithm. It doesn't matter about the licenses, and I think in the future you can have exactly the same thing in the context of finance. So I'll leave you with one quote because it doesn't happen often that a regulator does two things that I really like. So Andy Alden is the head of financial stability of the Bank of England. And he said something which, so first of all, he starts as a regulator saying, I have a dream, which is pretty remarkable for a regulator. But the second part is he talks about Star Trek. So here, who here is a Star Trek fan? One? Okay. So you're more Jean-Luc Picard or Captain Kirk?
More Captain Kirk.
More Captain Kirk? Okay. So Star Trek is that incredible sci-fi show, but essentially here you have a regulator, one of the head of the Bank of England, saying his dream is to be in a sci-fi spaceship that can monitor financial market in real time. That quote was said in 2015. And essentially this quote was preempting what we currently talk about RegTech in the context of regulators. He wants to be able to monitor on a single dashboard the risk, the money flows, the data flows in the financial system in a very simple, transparent manner. And regulators are now moving towards this. Regulators like this because they can better supervise market. Startups like it because compliance is cheaper, and banks like it because that way it decreases their current compliance cost. So that's really about it. I think now it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie and Janos. Let me start with the regulatory sandbox in Japan. We are going to let very much specific about Japan's regulation because it's very much specific and it's very much interested in right now. We have two great speakers to set up the overwhelming, sort of the overall picture of the regulatory global picture. I think that he explained a lot about Japanese regulation right now. From the perspective of sort of the fintech company, which PayPal is about the one thing P2P or transaction payment service. So we see as a barrier as the Japanese regulatory framework the twofold of major barriers, which all the SMEs, small and medium-sized companies, as well as the consumers, are very much facing and complaints against nowadays. First is under the Payment Service Act of Japan, which all the FTBO fund transfer business operators like PayPal or GMOs are subjected to. And there is a transaction limit of 1 million yen, Japanese yen. And the second would be the anti-money laundering regulation, which kicks off 100,000 Japanese yen for the threshold for the KYC, meaning that you have to identify yourself by uploading in the internet transaction, even uploading the driver's license or the passport, paper-based documents, and send it over to FTBOs. And FTBOs have to follow up with the KYC process by sending the postal mail, actual posting by that. So all the consumers or small-sized residents very much complained about the inconsistent sort of procedure of KYC as the second sort of barrier. We as FTBOs are sort of facing these barriers because there is no level playing field. To do the payment transaction for the underlying transaction of goods and services, not P2P though, for the commercial transactions, we have the other players of so-called payment gateways or SuperCharger in the Japanese way. SuperCharger providers like convenience stores, you can do the payment for the underlying transaction of goods and services. But they are not regulated, so they are not under the subject of transaction limit or anti-money laundering KYC threshold requirement. Let me elaborate a bit. About 1 million transaction limit. The FTBOs have to decline the transaction even though the underlying transaction is done. 1 million yen, think about the transactions you would like to, for example, purchase. Typical example of it would be auto parts or luxurious accessories or goods. And those are easy to offer 1 million Japanese yen, equivalent to $8,000 or more. And think about the cross-border transaction and e-commerce, for example. More than 25 transactions are over $10,000. So it's easy. And what happens is when you are declined the payment transactions by FTBOs because of this transaction limit, you have to rescind the underlying transaction. I said you have to. It's not legally have to, but 80%, according to a survey, 80% of the underlying transactions are rescinded because of the payment transaction is not done because of this transaction limit. So it would hugely impact the consumers, SMBs, as well as the payment service providers like FTBOs. Let me elaborate on the second part of the major buffer. 100,000 Japanese yen. Think about that. A lot of people complain, I need a Paul McCartney concert ticket right now. Do I have to do the KYC? Why? We have to go to the convenience store. Because of that, KYC cumbersome process. To elaborate that, there is no risk-based KYC. You have to do the upfront KYC on the startup transactions if you exceed 100K threshold. And you need, as I mentioned, the FTBOs followed up with postal delivery to confirm the address of the people or the person who applies to that account or that transaction. So we see that as some barriers facing the consumers, SMBs, as well as the payment service providers. So as two of you, the speakers, former speakers who talked about overall sort of the regulatory scheme or the idea of regulatory regime, we really have to present the themes of the regulatory framework in the fintech world right now. I think light touch regulation and industry-based sort of the principles standards are really necessary because regulation should be at least restrictive, not to hinder the innovation. And then we can get the efficiency, which gains a lot of enhancement of e-commerce, etc. And key factors, probably Janos has already mentioned, but in the fintech world, we need interoperability of the cross-border nature of the digital payment, especially in the fintech world, and level playing field for the similar business or similar product or service has to be similarly regulated. And risk-based approach, you don't need upfront KYC probably for a very small amount of buying some ticket. And probably self-regulatory guidelines done by the industry itself would be really effective. And the last part is we think that financial inclusion, cooperating with the other institutions, like not only the fintech world, but the financial institutions overall, or IT firms would be very much necessary. What we are aiming at by sort of getting rid of the barriers or proposing the new regime for the fintech would be enhancing ability of consumers and small and middle-sized merchants or the business. For example, let me go back to the transaction limit. If we raise 1 million yen to, for example, 3 billion yen, enhanced use of payment will be available to consumers and SMEs. Is there any risk involved? And then in other jurisdictions, for example, US, EU, Singapore, and Australia, there is no transaction limit. And there is no reported incident or the issues or the problems raising from the no transaction limit in those jurisdictions. So probably removing that transaction limit or raising up to, for example, 3 million would enhance the ability of consumers or SMBs in Japan. That we are aiming at. As far as the KYC is concerned, paperless would be the primary sort of the target for us. Digital KYC, as mentioned by Carrie, I think it's really important to get rid of the paperless KYC to get the paper-based KYC. We talk about the financial inclusion as the sort of one of the key themes of the fintech world of regulation. We have problems caused by the barriers we mentioned, but in US, you know them all. I think most of you know there is a word among the millennials that they will need to pay, for example, in the restaurant with a small amount of money among the friends and families, and you can donate that money and a registered group of people with one click. That's involved with SNS function, messaging function as well. So it's really interesting to use that function. And we provide a lot of payment options in one screen of payment application. We call it integration or the choice to let the people choose what they are looking for in the payment, not just force them into the bank account or credit card services. So it's important that we cooperate with the credit card companies, banks, etc. That enables the sort of the fintech innovative connect device or the innovation. Okay, let me elaborate once going back to the regulatory status in Japan. Janos and Carrie talked about a lot of the regulatory sort of like idea regime. In Japan, it's so segmented. We are famous for the transportation payment, prepaid card, like Ferica, but they have to register as a prepaid card issuer at IFSA. To do the accounting service, you need electronic intermediary service provider. It's going to be started from next year. For the payment service provider, who is actually doing the acquiring of the merchant with the acquirer of the credit card companies, starting next year, you have to register once you get the independent sort of the vetting system involved. But Shuno-like business is not regulated compared with the FTBO, as I mentioned. To do the P2P or to provide a payment service transaction for the underlying transaction of goods and services, you have to register as FTBO, and that kicks in the transaction limit as well as the KYC. So we are thinking about e-regulation that mentioned by Carrie and that important principle of fintech would be one size doesn't fit all anymore, and regulation should not hinder the innovation. So fintech world or the service or the product is not a single operation as Janos mentioned. Regulator must treat each of the service differently, independently, and assess the risk independently. And regulation, we think, should be performance-based rather not just entity-based. Look at the segmentation once again in the chart. We are so segmented in terms of the regulations. So if you really want to do prepaid card, P2P, payment for the goods and services, you have to register like 5 registration to the different even the jurisdiction of the regulators like FSA and METI, Ministry of Economy and Industry. Regulatory sandbox would provide us a very important sort of experimental status for that. Regulatory sandbox, as mentioned by Carrie and Janos, that exempt fintech startup from the current regulatory regulation. But it doesn't just allow the experiment. The important part of that would provide valuable insights to both service providers as well as the policymakers, because even the regulator can learn from the process of the regulatory sandbox what would be the potential risks, what would be the potential impairment, as well as the sort of simulating the legislative consequence that they are going to potentially set forth as a regulation in the future. So it's very important device. And actually, in Japan, we are catching up in the fintech world and in the regulation as well. So the government are eager to set the act to set forth the regulatory sandbox system or the scheme in Japan, which is coming probably next Diet session, hopefully. And as the UK and Singapore and Hong Kong system goes, it's pretty much the same regulatory sandbox scheme. Like clarifications for that will be to contribute the economy, to facilitate the innovation, as well as it's very much experimental. So it's the learning process. I think it's important because policymakers can learn the risks involved in that potential innovative device or the service, as well as our sort of service provider as well can assess what the regulators will think about or would like to control with regard to the service, potential service or products. We would like to very much propose as a thesis for the regulatory sandbox in Japan. It passed the Diet and it will be enacted, targeting in the very near future, thanks to all the efforts of the government right now in Japan. That would probably benefit as far as the 1 million yen transaction limit to be raised, for example, 3 million. That strengthens again the competitiveness of the small-sized and medium-sized business or the merchants as well as the consumers, because they get more access to the international payment services and probably access to fast risk money supply. It's ready because just raising the 1 million yen transaction limit would just systematically remove the flag of transaction limit amount to 0 or 3 million, for example. The least potential risks, because as I mentioned, there is no reported incident or problems caused by the countries, in the countries where there are no transaction limit, like US, Australia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The other KYC method, which are now under the consideration by the regulators as well, because of the outcry of the consumers and small SMBs for more convenient the KYC processes. The government is really like to sort of examine seriously about the alternative, innovative method of KYC, probably using blockchain or the other digital methods that would fully digitalize the performance. The paperless KYC, which probably detect the forgery before that, and simple interface by the consumers or SMBs would very much relax their pain point. And financial inclusion, again, the key to learn from. For example, how to do the KYC in the blockchain method. The policymakers in the sandbox process could probably learn the potential risks as well as the service provider to learn how the government would like to control in the future. And also mentioned about the regulator. We also believe that it's not the extension or enhancement of the fintech in the regulatory world. It's more like the paradigm shift that regtech notion would provide us, because it requires the holistic approach of the regulation. similar regulation to the similar sort of the service or the product would be the mandatory request for that RegTech. I need to make sure the level playing field would be honest to avoid the regulatory arbitrage. And again, I think the key is to balance the risk and innovation by learning process in depth from the both end of the service providers as well as the regulators. We aim at the democratization of the finance in the fintech world. So it's not just the fintech innovative device for the service, but it's real impact of the people who are employed, and fintech facilitates all the democratization of finance to sort of enhance the access by the people on every level of the lifestyle. And partnership again is the key in involving a lot of companies, industries, as well as the people from the consumer end. And we really want to encourage the improvement of the people's life and democratization of the finance from facilitating and promoting, as mentioned, education as well as the communities. Thank you very much.
Speakers for the amazing speech. Now we have 20 minutes. We will have a quick discussion between the panel before we open up the floor. I'm going to turn back to Noriko, not just because she's my colleague, but also she is her speech. I have more fresh memory as to us. So Noriko, as you mentioned, like Japan as a country or fintech, they have to change a lot, but they have also very risk-averse culture. They want to keep the tradition. They are very process-driven. So what do you think, like implications for that for fintech regulations?
Well, as I mentioned, Japan is really following up with all the other countries, like Carrie's country as well as the Janos country, because basically we are still very much risk averse, and also the myth of bureaucratic impossibility is still there. But as I mentioned, the government is changing looking from the attitude of treatment of the regulatory sandbox. They are going to enact a law to enable that. It's still draft stage, but they are really seriously examining that. Also, as I mentioned, KYC, they are talking about the innovating sort of measure or the method of the KYC. So I think we are moving forward and learning a lot from the other countries.
So in the context, I think the risk-averse culture is an interesting. Hong Kong has a little bit of that. I think failure in Asia is not something that is well accepted, and for parents, it's very hard to accept that your kid fails after having expensive university education. And so one of the solutions that I typically say to young, so I say two things. It's okay for a young person to fail because the later in life you fail, the more expensive failure becomes. You'll be married, you'll have kids, you'll have a mortgage, you'll have a house, and so really it's pretty risky if you fail. So typically what I say to young people that wish to be entrepreneurs is that, look, when you're at universities, either you work at Starbucks or you're either working in a startup. The reason is because both Starbucks and a startup will pay you terribly. But at least when you work in a startup, you'll get your earnings way more than what you would do in Starbucks. So working in a startup whilst at university allows you to do one thing. It allows you to learn about the learning environment, the startup culture, do you like it, do you not like it, etc., etc. What it allows to tell to your parent is like, oh, don't worry, this is just like a student job, and once I graduate, I'll do a proper job and I'll join corporate. Now, if the startup in which you work is taking off, it's easier to justify to your parents and see, look, they're doing very well, I want to stay and join there. So that's one way we approach, at least, how to hedge risk in that culture of I cannot fail with the local population. The other thing that really helped a lot is as fintech became more respected and well known, parents would be okay about this. So again, one of our team members, her parents challenged her to join our team, and then one day we go on TV, and essentially in Hong Kong there's only one TV channel. And when we appeared on TV, the parents said, oh, okay, we can stay in that company, because the fact of us being on TV made us legitimate. Universities doing degrees on fintech, regulators promoting fintech, parents love degrees in Hong Kong. And so if a university is now issuing a fintech degree, parents goes, oh, it's actually a valuable industry. Right? So that's how we approached risk in
To follow up on that, Carrie, so Japan recently there's a trend, Japanese regulator looking up to UK for regulatory sandbox, or for Europe for payment services. And you were very surprised to hear the FTPA regulations, where there's a spending limit of $100, or even for merchant, $8,000. So is there anything you think Japan regulators should really learn from UK or Europe?
Just checking this works. Yeah. I can believe that. I just find that absolutely stifling. I mean, think of the market opportunity and the economics, just the unit economics of the fact that you're just missing out on such a huge opportunity. So maybe, I mean, we see a number of things when people are struggling to change, which kind of does relate back slightly to the previous point, the previous question. But one of the things we see is that people are unable to connect the dots between what they really care about and where they sit today. So has the regulator and have the Japanese government and the kind of treasury teams really looked at the opportunity that you're shying away from? Maybe that's an outdated policy which is in place from years ago. Maybe it's, but in terms of the spending power of the consumer, why would you hinder them? I just don't think it's the role of the government to step in and say what you can and can't do. I think their job is to enable you to do what you want in a reasonable way. So I think there's definitely a point around them connecting the dots between the opportunity that they probably would like in terms of economic growth and the current regulation, and how I think the UK is a risk-averse culture. I don't think the UK government is known, we all know the meetings you have with British people and they say one thing and then they leave the room and they actually say another. So that is the culture in which we work, but I think the fact that the FCA have been able to connect the dots between the economic opportunity of fintech, and that's why they're doing these things. They're not doing them because all of a sudden they've changed the way they think about business or risk. They're doing them because they sense that the financial services industry in which we have a stronghold is shifting, and if we're not at the forefront of that, then we will lose in terms of GDP. So I think maybe what Japan needs to do is have a clearer picture on the economic growth that they want to achieve, and then look at the different ways that they're hindering that. We talk a lot about something called the change equation. It's a Gleicher model, but it's dissatisfaction with the status quo times the vision of the future times the first steps. The sum of that calculation has to be greater than the resistance to change. So I think it's, I suppose, all of our jobs to highlight the dissatisfaction with the status quo, to frame the vision of the future, and then to help people like regulators see the first steps.
So back to you, Janos. To answer your question on Star Trek, I'm a big Captain Kirk fan. And I'm very looking forward to this weekend opening of the new Star Trek with the Asian female captain. So I hope she will do well. Yeah. And the vision of having a really transparent, kind of dashboard of global view of the regulation, or even how money transfer is going on, is very amazing. But to do that, currently we are very globally very defragmented. So what's your view on the global regulation landscape, or any inputs you have from your work as Coco?
Sure. So glad that you're also a Star Trek fan, which resonates to my heart. The thing about having that global dashboard, if you think about what happened after the financial crisis, now you have something which has been in place, which is a unique legal identifier, which is every financial institution now has a barcode, and any product is linked to that financial institution. So more and more we start creating transparency and linkage in the system in the way that was not the case before. So the legal unique identifier is one example of the beginning of the dashboard that you have. You start to have that in derivative markets, so derivative clearing now, which is better centralized, and therefore you have a better understanding at any given time of the position and the risk exposure of a financial institution. Capital markets and even stock markets, incredibly transparent. And one of the best places to actually do regulation technology solution, because data is available, it's high risk because it goes on the consumer side, it goes on the institutional side, it goes on the financial stability side. A lot of money is there. I mean, we mention Deutsche Börse quite often. We talk about NASDAQ, about the acquisition of cybernetics. The reality is, like stock exchange are dying, and they have a fundamental necessity of changing their business. And they typically do that through acquisition, through better money, either data monetization through market monitoring. So those are examples where the market is actually fairly transparent. I think that the other market that could benefit from this would be, so the way I would see how you would build that dashboard, you won't build that dashboard from a single go. What you will do is, my gut feeling is securities regulators will be the first to actually properly do it. They will take a use case either on capital market or on peer-to-peer lending, because peer-to-peer lending is actually pretty transparent as well. They will then do, they'll do it in one country, then they will do many countries doing exactly the same segment, and then they'll start looking at all the segments. So it's a 5-year reform process, but my feeling is that that dashboard, you will see it first in the context of securities regulation. I think that central banks have that capacity, but they're not as data-driven that securities regulators were. Securities regulators have been using machine learning and essentially pattern analysis for the last 20 years. I mean, the SEC has used big data scientists since the late 90s. Because the information is so transparent and so available. Central banks way more difficult. Reporting is paper-based, it's fragmented, it's different. Securities are different.
Thank you. So before opening up to the floor, I want each of you to give your 1-2 short comment about Tokyo FinCEN and what do you think about the regulatory in Japan? Noriko, starting from you.
Well, this is actually the event that actually shows how we can interact with the regulators as well as the industry, also the consumers or the merchants. I think it's a great forum, and we really thank you for coming over as speakers from the board as well as the participants.
What I would say is, I think Tokyo is where Hong Kong was 2 years ago. I think Tokyo is where London was 6 years ago. Not a lot of people necessarily, but what you'll see is that in 2 years from now, in that same room for the same topic, you'll have 250, 300, 400 people in the same room. Right? And you are growing your knowledge at the same time as the industry is growing itself, which means two things. A, it's easier for you because you don't have to catch up, you can just build the knowledge at the same time. And I think that Japan is one of the largest fintech market opportunity. The arbitrage is clear. There's 150 stocks in Japan. There's 100 million plus consumer. It doesn't make sense. And so the question is, when will Japan have 1,500, 2,000 stocks? And it will have that. And so to go from 150 to 10 times that, more than that, will happen realistically in the next 2-3 years. And I think that's one of the biggest opportunity that all of you in this room, whether you're on the banking side that you want to work with stocks, whether you're on the regulator side that you need to supervise for, whether you're on the investor side, or whether you actually want to join or build a company, I think this is where you need to place yourself in Japan. Regulation is going to be difficult, but the way around regulation is you do B2B business. So think about this, right? If you don't put that, if Japan doesn't move in terms of regulation and you're an entrepreneur, don't keep hitting at it on the B2C side. Just switch your business and become a B2B business until regulation becomes a big factor.
So firstly, thank you. I've seen lots of sleepy faces, so obviously some of you managed to stay awake, which is always nice. So thank you for all joining, and I think a great event to be part of. Obviously, pretty a shame that all of the rooms are a bit disconnected, I think, but I think in general just a great group to be part of. 2 questions. One, firstly, show of hands if you work in a bank or an established organisation. I'm going to put like a PayPal in that a big organisation, multinational? 2, startup? 1, 2. Okay. I don't know where everyone else is then. In the middle, I guess. Does anyone here work at the regulator? Okay. So the shift is, next year, the regulator should have true representation here, and they should take the room that should be full of people concerned about this very seriously. And I think that if you want to have this ecosystem and you want to be at the forefront, then you drive change with your feet. As we're always told, change is, be the change you want to see. How do you start to challenge the regulator, right? It could be an article, it could be whatever it is, but you've got to drive it from the front, because I think if the regulator isn't in this room when you do this next year, that would be very concerning to me. Second point, I guess, what is the role that you want Japan to play in the fintech global ecosystem? I think, all fair well to say you need to change and you need to have lots of startups and you need to become that firm. But I think we were talking last night in preparation saying, not everyone has to have the same model to grow. You could say it's a more risk-averse nation, and therefore we're going to be someone that scales technology, or we're going to be the country that processizes some of these different ideas. You don't necessarily just have to, copy. There are new ways that you can transform. So, firstly, get the regulator in the room, take it seriously, and secondly, work out the role that you want to have in the global kind of ecosystem, and then regulations should sit to reflect that role that you want to have.
Thank you very much. So, I don't know if anyone here have any questions.
First of all, thank you very much for your exciting comments, and I'm very much inspired. Two questions. One is the fintech's dark side of force. At the moment, there are so many number of startups, and every day or every second, new product is born, and that's great. However, is there any risk that sometime in the near future, all of a sudden, a big company is dominating the market or monopolizing the market? And of course, that is the concern of the regulators. For example, if you look at the mainland China, Alipay is almost dominant. And if it goes up to the status of only one provider of the service in China, what will happen? And the same could be happening in Japan. For example, in 5 years' time, almost all payment is dominated by PayPal Japan. Should I be concerned or not? Hope not. that is my question, number one. Number two is the use of big data and the privacy of people. For example, if I am a frequent traveler to Hong Kong and spending $500, $600 every time on country's Chinese food restaurants, the data would be piled up in the system, and all of a sudden, soon, I will having this invitation from all the Chinese restaurants around the globe, especially in Tokyo. And it may come every second, and my smartphone will be overloaded. I don't want it, right? So how everybody is safeguarded from extra amount of such information or product pitches to come? That is my second question.
I'll give it a quick go. So, then Carrie, if you want to go, or Carrie, if you want to go. So the first thing is, so I appreciate that you're a Star Wars fan. I think there's a dark side, so I agree. More of a Trekkie film on my side. But the first question that you had is about oligopoly in tech, and the second question you had is about data protection. You pick a very unique example, which is a great and a bad example. It's a great example because it is clear that China, Alipay has built a dominant payment network, but for two reasons. First of all, payment typically is naturally oligopolistic. So it doesn't make sense for you to have a payment network that only is accepted by two merchants. You will want as many people as you can, and this is why Alipay, to be as widely useful, needs to be as widely distributed. China payment system has been incredibly inefficient, and therefore Alipay created a sort of 10x convenience improvement compared to the previous sector, therefore meaning that consumers loved it and took it. Now, the issue though is what happens if Alipay fails? Well, you still have UnionPay, which is equally strong in China, so you would have a duopoly as opposed to oligopoly in context of China. In context of data protection and data privacy, I think unfortunately, if you don't want your data to be shared, which is your right, and rightly so, right, because it's your own data, the way the game is currently being played is you'll be a second-class citizen. What I'm getting at is, and that's unfortunate, think about the insurance market. It's a very practical example. Currently, if you take an insurance, at least in Hong Kong, like in the UK and Europe, you self-disclose whether or not you have that disease, you self-disclose whether or not you have that illness, that previous condition, etc., etc. In the future, insurance companies will say, give me your data and then I'll issue you an insurance. If you don't want to give the data anymore to the insurance company, they will charge you a premium and they'll say, well, I don't know your risk, therefore I'm going to upprice you. The reality is because so many people at the individual level have the incentive of giving their data away, whoever doesn't play that game will now be at a disadvantage. And that's very much what's happening in China in the context of credit scores. So it's an opt-in model, but it's essentially in the end is not going to be optional, because if you don't share your data, you'll get a second-class service. And that's what's going to happen. And I think here is for the regulators and the policymakers to say, I'm going to stop that. And it's a policy decision. It's not a company decision. Companies have the incentive of monetizing your data. It's not going to go away. Only regulators or policymakers will be able to say, I don't accept that society, which is driven by data. It's a very fine line.
Yeah, I think the fear of dominance of one particular firm, from a personal perspective, is not as great for me as the fear of not moving with the market. So I personally think that one firm will not dominate, because what's likely to happen is that we get this kind of super fragmentation of the market where every consumer wants a slightly different experience, they want a slightly different product. And by freeing up the market, by freeing some of the regulations that you're talking about that you have in Japan, the limitations, I think they play into the hands of one big dominant player, because they actually, the companies that find their way around those regulations, the companies that have big general counsel legal teams that lobby the regulator, that do all of these things, that to me plays much more into the hands of the mass, the huge corporation that can dominate. And I think that if you strip those back, you enable, that's when you get lots more startups, that's when you get founders thinking, there's something in here. And it might be what a bigger firm, I used to be at a company that had 60 billion turnover, it might be something that a bigger firm they're not even interested in. It wouldn't get them out of bed to look at that opportunity. But for someone that maybe is that consumer or thinks that's something they really want to look at, that can be a huge business opportunity. So I think that you're more likely to hinder by regulating and by kind of having the current structures in place. And that will mean that, in my personal view, it's more likely that the bigger companies dominate because they kind of know how to play that game. I think by freeing up, you'll enable the change.
People owns the data, not people. So it's what we are doing. We really respect data privacy as well as the privacy of the information sent by the consumers or the users. Going back to the first question, it's the really that we really want to have the monopoly to get easier access and lower cost of, for example, payment service. It could be achieved by a lot of conglomerate type of business. But probably the key is, again, it's a sort of the general theme, but to the financial inclusion, to sort of do the cheaper, faster sort of service for the consumers and merchants, or the financial institutions or the other industry to just cooperate each other, so that, for example, for the personal data, we could set up some third-party institutions so that we can share the data, but it's not just actually the monopoly of one financial institution. That API sort of open up, or the openness of the API could sort of contribute to that as well, I think.
The only thing I'd add on your second question is I touched on EU GDPR, which is a regulation that's come out of Europe, and it's specifically about you owning your data as a consumer. Companies are going to have to pay 4% of their revenue in a fine if they can't prove that they're protecting and they have the right to look at that data of the individual. And it sounds like a great idea, and as soon as someone says about having an institution which will own the data, but I think as soon as sometimes you put these things in place, they become so complex and so difficult. The question will be with things like distributed ledger and blockchain, how much do we then take ownership of our data? And also, how much do you see companies change their behavior? Say your Chinese restaurants, they don't blast you with offers because actually they recognize that that wouldn't be relevant to you and that that isn't what you want, that isn't why you've given your data, which I don't think companies are yet in that place. But it would be nice to think that they would get there.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you. I have a question. What do you think about the most important risk of cross-border transaction with or without fintech? The risk could be, let's say, legal risk, financial risk, money risk, FX risk, etc. Thank you.
You're asking from what?
What do you think the most important risk for the transborder transaction with or without fintech?
Sure.
Let's say blockchain or something like that.
And in what industry do you work? I'm just trying to understand because you have thousands of different risks depending on the angle.
I'm in banking industry.
So you're in banking.
Yeah.
So actually, one of the biggest risks that cross-border has, and in general in finance, so I think one of the biggest issues you have is cybersecurity. SWIFT has been hacked, and it generated essentially cross-border transfer. So cybersecurity, in my view, both for the fintech perspective and for the financial institution perspective, in context of cross-border, cybersecurity has demonstrated that it's a big, big issue. Then I would say payment monitoring, so not KYC, but more AML, is one that you will also have to look at, especially as small players start to come in and they start moving on. But yeah, I would say cybersecurity and AML would be the larger risk, I would say.
I actually agree with the security would be the best. Actually, the survey shows done by our own company that what would be the barrier for the business or transaction to the consumers in general, as well as the small and middle-sized merchants. They said 20% of them would say it's security, and safety is the primary goal, choosing whatever the service providers.
We have time for one more question before we end the session. So big round of applause for the speakers, and thanks a lot for your time.